The blood was still warm when she ordered the Louvre stones washed. It was August 1572, and the metallic scent of carnage clung to every Parisian corner like a tangible ghost. Catherine de' Medici stood motionless before the window of her private chambers, watching bodies being dragged through the muddy streets. Her hands, adorned with rings that glittered in the flickering torchlight, held a small Venetian glass vial, empty now, after decades of serving purposes only she fully knew. At 53, the woman once described as the Italian serpent had orchestrated the massacre that would become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. But in that moment, as the echoes of screams still reverberated in her memory, Catherine knew she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. 43 years earlier, in 1529, a 10-year-old girl had set foot on French soil for the first time. Caterina Maria Romola di Lorenzo de' Medici arrived as a political gift wrapped in silk and brocade, betrothed to the future Henry II as part of a complex diplomatic game between Pope Clement VII and King Francis I. Her dark eyes, already penetrating and calculating, absorbed every detail of the French court with the veracity of someone who instinctively understood that survival depended on meticulous observation. The Florentine girl carried in her blood the legacy of the Medici, a lineage that had transformed gold into power and power into art, but which also knew intimately the bitter taste of poison and the whispered melodies of conspiracies. The early years of her marriage to Henry were marked by a silent humiliation that would forever shape her personality. Diane de Poitiers, 20 years Henry's senior, completely dominated the heart and mind of the future king. Night after night, Catherine watched as her husband left their marital bed to seek the arms of his official mistress. For a whole decade, her womb remained barren, fueling malicious rumors that the Italian was cursed or worse, that she practiced dark arts to sabotage her own fertility for mysterious reasons. Courtiers whispered that she spent hours locked in her chambers with alchemists and astrologers, seeking answers in the stars and in potions that exhaled strange and disturbing vapors. It was during these years of apparent powerlessness that Catherine began to weave the network of influence that would later transform her into the most feared woman in France. Her secret agents, a mix of diplomatic spies, Florentine merchants, and shadowy figures who moved between the court and the urban underworld, began to feed her information that she hoarded like deadly treasures. Intercepted letters, overheard conversations, bedroom secrets transformed into political weapons. Catherine absorbed everything with the patience of a spider weaving its web. Michel de Nostradamus, the astrologer who would become her intellectual shadow, arrived at court in 1555, bearing prophecies shrouded in Hermetic language, and Catherine found in him not only an advisor but a legitimizer of her darkest ambitions. The death of Henry II in 1559, during a tournament, marked the definitive moment of her metamorphosis. The Count of Montgomery's lance pierced the king's helmet and went through his eye, causing a 10-day agony that Catherine watched with a devotion that impressed even her fiercest critics. But those who knew her methods noticed something unsettling in her behavior during the long vigils beside the dying king. She whispered prayers in Latin mixed with Italian words that no one could fully understand, and her hands constantly manipulated a rosary of unknown origin. When Henry finally expired, Catherine emerged from the death chamber transformed, no longer the neglected wife, but the Queen Mother of France, guardian of 3 sons, who would become kings and possessor of a power she would wield ever more implacably. Francis II, her firstborn, ascended the throne at 15, but died just a year later in circumstances that fueled the first genuine suspicions about Catherine's methods. The young king developed an ear infection that quickly escalated into a fatal condition, and several witnesses reported that Catherine had personally insisted on preparing some of the remedies administered to her son. Charles IX, who succeeded him, was an even more malleable child, and it was during his regency that Catherine definitively consolidated her dominion over the mechanisms of French power. She transformed the court into a machine of espionage and manipulation where every word was weighed, every gesture analyzed, and every loyalty constantly tested through methods that combined seduction, blackmail, and, when necessary, physical elimination. The wars of religion that tore France apart during the 16th century found in Catherine both an instigator and a cruel arbitrator. She understood better than any contemporary that the conflict between Catholics and Huguenots offered unique opportunities to consolidate royal power, provided it was manipulated with surgical precision. Her strategy consisted of feeding both sides with calculated promises and betrayals, keeping the country in a state of controlled tension that made her indispensable as a mediator. Documents preserved in the royal archives reveal the extent of her duplicity, simultaneous letters to Catholic and Protestant leaders, offering military support and guarantees of protection that she knew were mutually exclusive. René de Birague, her chancellor and closest confidant, left disturbing accounts of Catherine's methods during this period. According to his private records, the Queen Mother kept in her private chambers a collection of substances he described as medicines and poisons in equal measure. Carefully labeled in Latin on Venetian glass vials were powders, liquids, and ointments of mysterious origin, some of which emitted nauseating odors even in small quantities. Birague noted that Catherine knew the properties and dosages of these substances with a precision suggesting years of study and practical experience, and that she herself prepared certain mixtures using techniques she had learned from Florentine alchemists in her youth. If you've enjoyed these accounts unveiling the darkest layers of history, consider subscribing to our channel for more narratives revealing the best-kept secrets of power and human nature. The period leading up to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre represents the height of Catherine's manipulative prowess. For months she orchestrated a campaign of misinformation and provocations that turned Paris into a powder keg ready to explode. The marriage of her daughter Margot to Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot leader, was presented as a gesture of national reconciliation, but Catherine knew perfectly well she was luring key Protestant leaders into a deadly trap. Letters preserved in the Vatican archives reveal that she corresponded regularly with Pope Pius V, detailing her plans to purify France of Protestant heresy through methods the Church could not publicly endorse. The attempted assassination of Gaspard de Coligny on August 22, 1572, was the final spark. The Huguenot admiral, wounded but not killed by a shot fired from a window controlled by Catherine's agents, instantly became a symbol of Protestant martyrdom and a direct threat to the kingdom's stability. During the following 48 hours, Catherine worked feverishly to convince her son Charles IX that only drastic action could save the monarchy. Witnesses reported that she spent the night of August 23, 24 locked with the king in his private chambers, and that the screams and lamentations emanating from the royal chamber could be heard in the adjacent corridor. When they emerged the following morning, Charles IX had aged years in a matter of hours, and Catherine displayed a terrifying expression of satisfaction that chilled the blood of everyone present. The signal for the massacre to begin was given by the tolling of the bell of the Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois church, but Catherine had carefully prepared a network of executioners awaiting her specific orders. Detailed lists with names, addresses, and particular instructions circulated during the early morning hours among the Catholic leaders, and surviving witnesses reported that some of the killings were carried out with a precision suggesting intimate knowledge of the victims' habits and routines. Gaspard de Coligny was found in his bed, stabbed multiple times and then thrown out the window, in a theatrical staging bearing the mark of the calculated cruelty that characterized Catherine's operations. For the next 3 days, as Paris transformed into a human slaughterhouse, Catherine maintained an almost normal routine, receiving regular reports on the progress of the carnage and giving specific instructions on which lives should be spared and which should be eliminated. Documents preserved in the French National Archives include notes written by the Queen Mother herself, ordering the deaths of specific Protestant merchants whose properties would later be confiscated for the benefit of the crown. In one such note, dated August 25, she instructed her agents to ensure that the goldsmith Etienne Marcel does not survive Dawn, but that his daughters be spared for possible future use. The clinical coldness of this language revealed a mind that had completely transformed political assassination into a form of administrative art. the psychological consequences of the massacre on Charles IX were devastating and immediate. The young king, who had been manipulated by his mother into authorizing the carnage, began to exhibit signs of mental collapse that intensified week after week. He developed chronic insomnia, tormented by nightmares, in which he constantly heard the screams of the St. Bartholomew's Day victims. His personal physicians reported that he had begun experiencing episodes of inexplicable nosebleeds, and that his hands trembled uncontrollably whenever the subject of religion was mentioned. Catherine, observing her son's mental deterioration with the same scientific coldness with which she had planned the massacre, began to consider the possibility that Charles IX had become an obstacle to her future plans. The king's death in 1574, at the age of 23, was officially attributed to tuberculosis, but several circumstances raised suspicions that were never fully clarified. Pierre de l'Estoile, a contemporary chronicler known for the accuracy of his records, noted that Charles IX had spent his last days in a state of constant terror, refusing to be alone with his mother and insisting that independent tasters sample all food and drink offered to him. In his personal notes, l'Estoile described a disturbing scene that occurred a few days before the royal death. His Majesty cried incessantly that he saw blood gushing from his hands, and that the odor of the decomposing bodies of St. Bartholomew's Day had permanently permeated his chambers. The Queen Mother observed these manifestations with an expression I can only describe as scientific satisfaction. Henry III, Catherine's favorite son and her last instrument of power, represented both the peak and the beginning of the decline of her influence. Intelligent, cultured, and deeply neurotic, the new king had spent years observing his mother's methods and developed a mixture of fascination and revulsion that would characterize his entire reign. Catherine had invested decades, shaping Henry according to her political needs, and initially he proved to be an exemplary pupil, implementing policies that further consolidated royal power and systematically eliminating rivals his mother identified as dangerous. During the early years of Henry III's reign, Catherine's influence reached almost supernatural proportions. She had transformed the French court into a power machine that functioned entirely according to her will, and her espionage networks extended throughout Europe, providing her with information that often reached her ears before the sovereigns directly involved. Foreign ambassadors reported to their rulers that it was impossible to understand French politics without considering Catherine's desires and whims, and that negotiating with France meant, in practice, negotiating with a woman whose cruelty was surpassed only by her strategic intelligence. However, signs of wear and tear began to manifest subtly but persistently. Age was taking its physical toll on Catherine, who at 60, had developed obesity that hampered her movements and respiratory problems that forced her to constant pauses during her audiences. Even more worrying was the fact that Henry III was beginning to demonstrate increasing independence, making important decisions without consulting her, and on some occasions directly contradicting her recommendations. The relationship between mother and son gradually transformed into a silent psychological war, waged through palace intrigues and increasingly desperate manipulations. The question of royal succession became the final battlefield between Catherine and the historical forces that were beginning to escape her control. Henry III had no children, and the legitimate heir was Henry of Navarre, the same Huguenot leader who had miraculously survived the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and had ironically become the only hope for dynastic continuity. The prospect of seeing a Protestant on the French throne represented a complete negation of everything Catherine had fought for over decades, but her ability to influence events was rapidly deteriorating. The Catholic League, led by the Cayce family, began to operate increasingly independently, implementing a radical agenda that often clashed with Catherine's more subtle interests. Henry of Cayce, in particular, had developed a power base of his own that rivaled royal authority, and his popularity among extremist Catholics represented a direct threat to the system of control Catherine had spent decades building. She tried to apply against Cayce the same methods she had used against so many other enemies, but she discovered that the League leader had learned from the mistakes of his predecessors and effectively protected himself against poisons, assassins, and other traditional forms of political elimination. The Day of the Barricades, on May 12, 1588, marked the moment when Catherine definitively understood that she had lost control over the events she herself had set in motion. Paris rose up in revolt against Henry III, forcing the king to flee the capital and leaving Henry of Guise as the de facto lord of the city. Catherine, for the first time in decades, found herself in a position of complete impotence, watching from exile as the fruits of her manipulations turned against her and her family. Her attempts to negotiate with Cayce were met with thinly veiled contempt, and she realized that the man she had helped to empower now saw her as an obsolete relic of a bygone era. The death of Henry of Guise, assassinated on the orders of Henry III in December 1588, represented simultaneously a tactical victory and a strategic defeat for Catherine. Although the king had eliminated his most dangerous rival, the method employed, assassination during a meeting of the Estates General, shocked Catholic opinion and transformed Cayce into a martyr. Catherine, who had spent her life practicing and perfecting the art of political assassination, immediately recognized that her son had made a fatal error of timing and execution. The king had used her techniques, but without her subtlety, and the consequences were disastrous. The last months of Catherine's life were marked by a deep melancholy that contrasted dramatically with the relentless energy that had characterized her political career. She spent weeks locked in her chambers, refusing to receive visitors and dedicating long hours to writing letters that she then burned without sending. Her physicians reported that she had developed a disturbing obsession with mirrors, spending hours contemplating her reflection and whispering words that no one could understand. In her personal notes, discovered after her death, she repeatedly wrote the phrase, "El sang chiama sang," blood calls for blood, in an increasingly shaky and desperate handwriting. When news of Henry III's death reached her on January 5, 1589, Catherine de' Medici was alone in her chambers at the Château de Blois, surrounded by the ghosts of a life dedicated entirely to manipulation and power. Henry III had been assassinated by Jacques Clément, a fanatical Dominican monk who considered the king a traitor to the Catholic faith. The irony was perfect and cruel. The man she had molded to be her supreme instrument had died a victim of the same extremist forces she had nurtured and manipulated for decades. Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot she had tried to eliminate at St. Bartholomew's Day, had become Henry IV of France, initiating a new dynasty that would consolidate the very kind of religious tolerance Catherine had fought against with all the resources of her formidable intelligence. She died 13 days later, on January 18, 1589, at the age of 69. Her last words, reported by her confessor, were a disturbing mix of Latin and Italian that he described as prayers and curses in equal measure. Her body, found the following morning, presented a facial expression that contemporaries unanimously described as terrible to behold, a mask of fury and despair that seemed to summarize a lifetime dedicated to the darkest aspects of human nature. The legacy of Catherine de' Medici remains one of the most controversial in European history, dividing historians between those who see her as a pioneer of royal absolutism and those who consider her simply a crowned psychopath. Her methods, the systematic use of poison as a political tool, the manipulation of religious conflicts to consolidate personal power, the transformation of the French court into a machine of espionage and blackmail, set precedents that would influence the exercise of monarchical power for centuries. But perhaps her true legacy lies in the terrifying demonstration of how intelligence, when completely divorced from human compassion, can transform into a force of destruction that consumes both its victims and its practitioners. Catherine's contemporaries, Even those who served her faithfully left records revealing the psychological cost of coexisting with someone capable of such calculated coldness. René de Barrug wrote in his memoirs that serving the Queen Mother was like constantly walking on thin ice, knowing that a misstep could mean not only a fall, but complete disappearance. Michel de Nostradamus, in private letters discovered in the 18th century, described his sessions with Catherine as consultations with a soul that had deliberately chosen to embrace darkness, and who found in prophecies not spiritual guidance, but confirmation of her most destructive instincts. The France that Catherine left behind was a country traumatized by decades of violence, manipulation, and political instability. The wars of religion had torn apart the fabric of French society, creating divisions that would persist for generations, and establishing precedents of intolerance and brutality that would profoundly influence national political development. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in particular, remained etched in the collective memory as a symbol of humanity's capacity for organized and premeditated evil, a grim reminder of how power, when exercised without moral limitations, can produce consequences that transcend any immediate political calculation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Catherine's legacy is the way she demonstrated the possibility of transforming cruelty into an art form, developing methods of manipulating and eliminating enemies that combined practical effectiveness with almost aesthetic sophistication. Her poisons were prepared with the same attention to detail that others devoted to music or painting. Her conspiracies were structured with the architectural complexity of a Gothic cathedral. Her assassinations were executed with the precise timing of a theatrical performance. She proved that it was possible to exercise evil systematically, intelligently, and even elegantly, establishing a standard of refined wickedness that would influence despots and tyrants for centuries. Catherine de' Medici's death did not represent the end of her influence, but only its transformation from an active force into a dark legacy. In the decades that followed, rulers throughout Europe would study her methods and adapt her techniques to the specific needs of their own political contexts. The systematic use of poison as a diplomatic instrument, the manipulation of religious conflicts to consolidate secular power, the transformation of the royal court into a center of espionage and blackmail. All these Catherine innovations became standard elements of the European political repertoire, demonstrating how evil, once systematized and refined, possesses a capacity for perpetuation that transcends the life of its original creators. In the end, Catherine de' Medici remains a terrifying reminder of humanity's capacity for calculated wickedness, and how intelligence, divorced from compassion and morality, can transform into a force of destruction that consumes both the world around it and the soul of the one who wields it. Her life was a masterful demonstration of power without ethical limits, and her death, a confirmation that even the most skilled manipulators are, ultimately, victims of their own creations. In the darkness of her last days, alone with the ghosts of her victims and the weight of her choices, Catherine experienced the inevitable fate of those who choose to embrace darkness, to discover that, in the end, darkness embraces them back, and that there is no escape for those who have transformed cruelty into their only art form.